I have the pleasure today of speaking with one of the world's greatest living explorers, and amazingly, an author and editor of more than 25 books, Mr. Robin Hanbury-Tenison. Welcome, Robin. Such a delight to see you again, my friend. How are you doing?
Pleasure to be with you, David.
You know, a little more history, I think, is necessary because your background is so remarkable. I mean, you went to Eton College, Magdalen College at Oxford. Since 1960, you've been exploring the use of wind, solar, water, and biomass for energy. Most people didn't even know what those things were for 25, 30 years. In 1977, I understand you led 115 members of the Royal Geographic Society through the Amazon rainforest for 15 months. It's just remarkable. 1981, you received the OBE from the Queen, Order of British Empire. Also a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society, not surprising. Also a fellow of the Linnean Society of London. You're a co-founder and president of Survival International, supporting tribal peoples around the world, not surprising given your history. And if that's not enough, as I understand it, on your 80th birthday, you assigned yourself 8 great tasks, one of which was to run the London Marathon. I'm tired just ticking off your accomplishments, but that's a remarkable background. Are you as tired as I am?
Yeah, it sounded exhausting. I was just very cross about being 80. I just found 80 an annoying age. You can't pretend you're young anymore once you're 80. So I thought I'd spit in the eye of the gods and do a few silly things and raise at least £80,000 for charity.
Absolutely. And I have to say, you don't have to act like you're young. You have to act like you're 50, and people will think you were just born. So it's pretty remarkable. So I have idea really where to start. So I want to just jump in the middle of things. Your last book, unless you've written another one since then, is Taming the Four Horsemen, which I understand you published in 2020. And there are a lot of things there. You've explored and touched on so many important points. Um, can you walk me through basically your overview and your thinking there? And I am ultimately going to want to ask you about how you literally predicted the pandemic before it happened.
Well, recent years, there have been many, many dramatic changes in the world, not least in the whole debate about climate change. And I mean, it's in the fact in the last 2 or 3 years that I think the debate has finally come to a successful conclusion, if you can call it that, in that most people now accept that climate change is real. When I wrote this last book of mine, and I'm now writing the sequel, 3 or 4 years ago, it was still very much a matter of debate. And a lot of people were arguing against it and saying it wasn't real. There were some very powerful and articulate naysayers in the game. And I wrote my book after doing a good deal of research on examining what the results of climate change and of the other catastrophes facing the world were likely to be, and what possible radical solutions there might be to them, one of which was that a pandemic was likely. And I based the book as a sort of theme for making it more accessible and readable on the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, because this is all an apocalyptic story. In fact, it's also an eschatological story, not scatology, which is something quite different, but eschatology, which is about the end of the world, doom-laden forecasts. And so the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse make a nice format for a book. The first one, the White Horse, is pestilence in the Bible, and that's very easily transposable into pandemics. And so I found myself saying on page 4 of this book, which was published in February 2020, I say there is about to be an imminent global pandemic. Every epidemiologist that I've researched on this says that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. It's coming. And sorry about the dog.
No, every great man
That's
has to
nature
have
for
at
you.
least 1 or 2 pets hanging around.
Yeah, well, there's always a dog barking somewhere. Anyway, amazingly, I have for pandemic on the cover of the book as one of the things that are about to happen. And blow me, a month after the book was published in February 2020, I was one of the very first people in Britain to go down with it very badly, very nearly die, and in fact be brought out of the coma that I was in for 5 weeks, in hospital for more than 7, by being wheeled into a healing garden. And so that was another little fundraising thing I did. I raised 150,000 to have a healing garden in our hospital here in the county of Cornwall. So the theme of the book was the apocalyptic issues that face us on the planet and trying to look at radical ways of solving those. And in the case of pandemics, of the first one, I was able to get on to one of my high horses, which is that the amount of money spent on research into outer space is money wasted because the great brains that are spending their time researching that and the huge amounts of money being spent on it should be devoted to examining our own infinity of life on this fantastic planet that we live on. And that's where we should be concentrating all our efforts. And if we understood the microbial activity of the world and the huge diversity that exists here, if we understood that better than we do, and we really don't understand it nearly as well as we think we do, then we probably wouldn't have had a pandemic, and we certainly would be facing a much more secure future than we are at the moment.
Yes, your book talks a lot about sort of how bacteria literally allow us to live. If we didn't have them inside of us, and we're busy taking all kinds of medicines and drugs to kill the bacteria, and in reality, they allow us to live, digest our food, and all those things. It's quite a remarkable blind spot.
Well, they don't just allow us to live. We are bacteria. We don't exist. We are a bunch of bacteria with nutrition going in one end and coming out the other, and the bacteria feed on it. And this gives you a whole different slant on what existence means and what intelligence means. And the intelligent life forms that we have on this planet, which are different from ours, but no less exciting in many ways as we research them, is another whole dimension of this fresh way of looking at life and indeed death on this planet.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you have such a perspective, I guess is the right word, and that's the wisdom that I guess that comes with age. And I'm always troubled about our population explosion, so out of balance with natural ecosystems. What are your thoughts about artificial human literally crushing out all the rest of the natural systems that should function in balance with us that we don't seem to recognize?
Too right. Population is the big elephant in the room in many of these debates, and it's very often people having too many children and having large populations are blamed for the problem. And I don't think it's that way around at all. I think that we need to look at the question of population quite differently. And if the solutions that I suggest in my book were applied, I believe that they would bring about a better world, a Garden of Eden, which we live in, a paradise, which we should be living in. And if we did, if we were secure in our aspirations and our harvests and our future, population would drop, because the only contraceptive that works in my book is prosperity. The only countries with falling populations are prosperous ones, like the United States and Europe, and Scandinavia, and so on. And it's where you are insecure about your future, where you don't know whether there's going to be a harvest, where you have droughts and famines and floods, that people tend to have lots of children. And so my solutions would, in the long run, the very long run, I think, solve the population problem as well. And we could all live in harmony with nature, with a stable population, without needing to destroy more of the planet in order to feed our exploding population. The other sort of solutions for population have manifestly not worked very well.
Which are you referring to? Wars?
Well, compulsion. Well, of course, or indeed leaving it to the four horsemen: war, famine, plague, and death. Those are what will reduce our population in the end radically if we let them do it. But we are clever enough to make a world, create a world in which we don't need to have such a exploding population. It's a different approach.
A totally different approach, and it's important. I mean, another approach that I have really been inspired to think about, the work of John Liu, who's involved with us on Ecoflix, is talking about restoring the earth. And you know, our parents lived through the world wars, and at least my parents. I don't. You weren't old enough to fight in a war, were you?
Not old enough to fight and never enough to be aware of it.
I didn't think so. Good. So, but that was the great challenge of their generation. That was the call to action, the one great thing they had to do to save the world, really. And I think now, as John Liu has coined it, restoration of the earth is the great work of our time. And he has said that if you value the earth and the wealth that comes from it, instead of cars and airplanes and computers, and you value the natural earth that is regenerative and doesn't go on a trash heap every 3 to 6 months or years, depending on what it is, we could have forever replenishing wealth. And instead, we're putting all this emphasis on really toys in the long run. And if you don't have air, and you don't have water, and you don't have soil that can grow crops, what good's our money? So I think that is a very important perspective for our time that I don't think enough people have considered.
Interesting perspective. I would go much further than that and say that our responsibility now is not just to restore Europe, which is fairly well restored since the war, thanks to the Marshall Plan and so on, and the generosity of the United States. Europe is pretty stable. We've got a lot to do to restore the environment in Europe and the ecology. But where the danger is coming is further east, is from Russia and Africa and indeed Southeast Asia, where pretty terrible things are happening. And if we had been as generous, if you, the United States, had been as generous in 1990 to Russia when communism collapsed as you were to Europe when the Nazis were overthrown, I think we'd be in a very different world now, because a lot of it comes from resentment. That's a different story. I think the big issue is the climatic effects of climate change and desertification in the Southeast Asia and Africa, which are going to have catastrophic effects on the whole world, because population will continue to explode, because, as I say, there isn't prosperity to diminish it, and because people will want to migrate. And there is going to be a huge problem with people developing fortress Europe, which is not a good idea, but is looming on the horizon.
Yes, there's so many aspects of that to explore, but I mean, one is water insecurity that has led to so many things. And of course, desertification, like you're talking about, is just a human problem for the most part. We have trashed ecosystems and didn't balance them, didn't pay attention to things that intuitively we knew. We were living off the environment beautifully until we got too smart for our own good. And I think it's that back in touch with nature phenomenon that we just desperately need. And it's interesting because probably nobody in the world knows more about indigenous people than you do. I mean, you've traveled and lived with them. Maybe you can share some of your insights, and I think they're pretty remarkable, involving indigenous peoples and what they know that we don't.
Well, I have been lucky enough to travel with probably over 100 different tribes around different parts of the world and see how they do live, big cliche, but they do live in harmony with nature. Doesn't mean their lives are perfect. It doesn't mean they are perfect, but it is unacceptable to them. I've seen it again and again to destroy their environment. I remember one time with the Kuna Indians in the interior of Panama once, Bayana Kuna. I went and was spending time warning them about a dam that was going to be built there, the Bayona Dam, which was going to flood all their land. And while I was with them, they went out to the river with a great big net that they had. and they cast the net into the river and came up with a huge draft of fishes. It was almost biblical. And there was great celebration, and they brought those fish in, and they filleted them and hang them up to dry, and they had a whole supply for the next 6 months or a year that was going to keep them in fish. And I said, wow, that's wonderful. The river's full of fish. You're going to do that again next week? And they looked at me as though I was insane. And they said, don't be ridiculous. If we did that all the time, we'd run out of fish. We do it once a year. And I said, but there's so many fish in the river. I mean, it's heaving with them. Can I go down? And they said, no, we fish it once a year. We get a big draft of fish, and the rest of the time, we don't do that. And that was just so wise. And you know, we would, in the West, would not be able to resist exploiting our resources all the way. And we see it all the time. I mean, we can't leave rainforest alone. We can't leave wilderness alone. We have to try and milk it for food and nourishment. And that's just crazy, I'm afraid. And that's something we can learn from indigenous people.
Oh, so true. And you know, in simple terms, it's long-term thinking. We think, you know, cycle to cycle, meal to meal, not, you know, even weeks or months at a time. The idea that you can destroy the source of your bounty seems pretty illogical, and yet we do it every day, everywhere. And it's hard for those of us who've started really focusing on it at some point in the past, and we keep making those mistakes. It's frustrating that we can't get to the front of the pack of people roaring and shouting about one thing or another. But this is going to be the fate of humanity. We either fix this or we're going to be extinct, and we'll have deserved it. We'll have earned that moniker. But I'm interested. Talk a little more, if you would, about the conditions of living in an Amazon rainforest, because I created my background in honor of you today. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I was on one expedition, which was a military expedition. It was not something I'd ever done before, but I was invited by the leader of the expedition, one Colonel John Blashford Snell, who was hacking a path through the Darien Gap with the idea that the British would pioneer away with their new Range Rover. This was way back in the early 70s, from Alaska to Terra del Fuego, which had this one embarrassing little gap in it, which was the Darien Gap, which is about 250 miles of dense rainforest with some of the heaviest rainfall in the world. And nobody had ever driven a vehicle right through there. One or two people had hacked their way and walked through. But he was determined to get these vehicles through. It was a big military expedition, 75 of them. And they blasted, dynamited, and dragged their vehicles through this terrible muddy swamp and had a terrible time. 75% of them were invalided out with illnesses, and they weren't allowed to eat the local food. They had to live on compo rations. But in his generosity, he asked half a dozen scientists, of which I was one, not really a scientist, but I was asked to go and see the effect that the road would have on the indigenous people. And I spent my time with the Choco and the Kuna people discussing all this and living with them. I only spent 3 days in all in base camp. And I lived on local food and swam in the rivers, drank river water, had no rations or anything with me at all. And when it came to giving the talk about it, when we all got back, I said, it's the most wonderful area. And there'd been a whole lot of lectures that there were 12 of us all made the speech in front of all the big brass in the British Army, and including the ambassadors from Colombia and Panama. And they get this big story about the green hell that they'd hacked their way through and how awful it had been. When it came to my turn, I said it was one of the most beautiful and pristine, peaceful and healthy environments I've ever been in. I had no moment of sickness. I was drinking water out of the river and living out of the Indian with the Indians. And the two ambassadors both got up and clapped and said, at least somebody's saying something nice about our country now for once. And it was a complete, for me, manifestation of the contrast between the attitude so many well-meaning good people have towards the environment is go there and dominate it, cut it down, grow more crops. If we've got a rainforest, it must be a good place for growing crops. No, it's not. If there's a fish in the sea, let's get more of them. Let's blast them out of the bottom of the ocean and scrape the ocean for them. And of course, that's a counsel of despair. That's all was going to destroy the planet we're living on. And we're now seeing the result of a couple of hundred years of that kind of approach to nature, and we've got to be closer to the indigenous approach, which is unthinkable that you should destroy the very resource. There's a very good rule of seven. I can't remember exactly what it's called, that it's designed by one of the North American Indian tribes, which is, they say, unless it lives for 7 generations, we shouldn't do it. Unless the result will be good for 7 generations, you shouldn't do it. But nobody today thinks in terms of 7 generations. We don't think about our great, 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 great grandchildren. It isn't in the sort of Western philosophy, and that we've got to get back to that thinking, that we are only a part of nature, and it's our responsibility to respect it.
Yes, it seems that Western, especially economies, are built on the notion that nature's out there and we're over here.
Yeah.
And we can dominate nature, as you put it, whenever we need to. But for the most part, it has nothing to do with us. We have our cities, we have our environments, whether they be offices, cars, limos, and none of the rest of that matters to us. It is quite remarkable, and people would consider it the most remarkable hardship to go out in their backyard and stay in a tent overnight. It would be just unthinkable.
Yeah.
And yet, if you've never laid on your back and looked up at the stars and listened to nature, you've missed a lot. I don't know who talks about those kind of things anymore. It seems like society has moved past the notion, and we gotta, clawing and kicking, drag it back to the idea that we are just part of nature. We aren't a thing to ourselves. I don't know where that came from.
Well, it's that kind of thinking that's brought us to the pretty pass we're in now. I mean, it is said we only have half a dozen or a dozen harvests still before the soil, most soil will be so depleted that it won't be producing anymore. And I think it is very exciting that people are now aware of this and accepting it and are scared. And we should be very scared, because we are so dependent on our own technology that if that collapses, and it easily could, I mean, there are many ways that our society could break down very quickly, not just through the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, wars and famines and so on, which are the most likely ways, but also imagine if there was a sunspot, a serious one, which took out all the satellites, and by association took out all the electricity on the Earth. There would be riots within 48 hours, and we would be having cleaned out all the supermarkets. If there was no electricity and no communication, we would be in a very parlous state. And as you say, who knows how to skin a rabbit, cook a rabbit, let alone kill a rabbit nowadays, to feed ourselves off the land. And our gardens would run out. The whole infrastructure could collapse very easily. I don't want to sound more apocalyptic than I already am, but there are serious dangers out there. And the trouble is, I don't want it to happen, because it would be very, very difficult to put it right. But we should be aware that there are serious dangers out there, and we should be addressing them. And at last, I think people are beginning to take a grip. I was at COP26 in you were there as well. You were there, weren't you?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't, but
I was in London at the time.
I met you in London around that time.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was interesting that that there were very serious governmental and industrial people talking about the whole issue there at COP26. And I believe that the world is beginning to take this seriously. Unfortunately, we get sidetracked by things like wars and famines and disasters, which take a priority. But we should be seriously considering ways to save the world.
Yes, and that's why John, and I agree with him, has said restoration of the earth is the great work of our time. And you talk about losing power. I mean, the first thing I would probably cheer about is losing social media, because I think it's fun for about an hour, and then you start to see the long-term negativity that's associated with it. And I don't know if it's really even a positive, much less a necessity. I think that if we lost power, you're referring to sort of the loss of central governmental controls and warnings and communications, and I think that's valid. but I think as societies, we go back to localities and worrying about our own environments and not relying on somebody to kill our animals in the Amazon so we can eat here. And I don't know that it wouldn't be better, because all of the ecosystems of the world, as you've pointed out, are under very similar stressors. And the combination of the current water crisis is combined with rising oceans at a massive level. And it's so anomalous. We have more water than we can stand. It's going to flood many places. Norway is toast. I mean, there's going to be lots of countries that are going to have terrible problems if we don't figure this out. And at the same time, we have excess ocean water. We don't have enough clean water. It's got to be balanced in so many places and ways, and I just don't see enough people working on it. I see a
I think
lot
one
of
of the
people.
problems is, as you so rightly say, that these disasters are looming, and we've seen signs of them. But I don't think we've been scared enough yet. I don't think we've realized the generally people are not aware of the link between our behavior and what's happening to the planet. I remember one occasion some years ago when your great oceanographer Sylvia Earle was speaking at the London Literary Festival, and I had the privilege of hosting her on this platform. And she told us all about the amazing things they were doing with oceanic research. And her main area of research had been the Gulf of Mexico. And it was just at the time of the catastrophe there when the huge oil spill had happened. And it was literally 3 or 4 weeks after that. And all the news was full of pictures of oil-covered birds and a disaster. And everybody was very upset by that. And somebody in the audience asked a question at the end and said, because she hadn't mentioned it, and said, what did she think about the oil spill? And she looked at me and said, do you think they can take the truth on this? And I said, well, they're a sophisticated audience. It's London Literary Festival. Yeah, I think they can probably handle it. Sock it to them. And she said, it wasn't bad enough. And there was absolute pin drop silence because we were all in shock anyway from what we'd been seeing on the television.
Yeah.
And they
Bad
said,
enough to shock people into action.
what do you mean?
Yeah.
And she said, it wasn't bad enough. In a few weeks, months, let alone years, everybody will have forgotten about it and will have moved on to the next problem. What we need is a massive catastrophe identified as being caused by humanity's stupidity, and then we will get shaken out of our complacency.
Yeah, that's so true.
I've never seen an audience so shocked by an answer at a talk.
And so true. I mean, it's just social media and cycles, news cycles, sort of open and close issues, and that's the end of them.
Yeah.
Your conversation about that reminds me of a sort of an apocryphal story. Man is speaking to the audience, expert, and he says, in a billion years, as the earth as we know it will cease to exist. And a woman in the back raised her hand and she said, did you say a million or a billion? He said, a billion. She said, whew, for a minute there, I thought you said a million.
Oh dear.
Yeah. But I mean, in reality, we're, as you point out, within lifetimes of seeing massive biblical changes that literally cannot be turned around in short order. We still have, as most people think, our hands on the ledge. We could still pull ourselves back and put things in balance if we got cracking now.
I couldn't agree more.
I don't see that kind of energy, and I'm hopeful that a combination of the young, the middle-aged, the elderly, all people with wisdom and will get together and start moving. And all the naysayers, send them out to the goby and let them sit there while other people are doing something productive, because they're going to be the loudest voice when it happens. They're going to be the ones, how could you let this happen?
The young. Well, I think it's very exciting the way the young have become alerted to the problem and are very angry with the older generation for allowing it to happen, and quite rightly. And although there's a lot of negativity in the protests by Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and so on. They're so angry and so despairing. I've been saying to them quite a lot, you should be proud of the fact that you've kicked capitalism and all the other issues that are responsible for this in the backside, because that it isn't good. You don't want a revolution. You don't want to have anarchy. But what you do want is to make the existing systems work and make them take their responsibilities seriously. And that's what I saw in Glasgow at COP26, was that people were beginning to take it seriously. It's happening much too slowly. There's much too greenwashing. But by and large, the world is becoming aware. And the more catastrophes we have, awful though they are, the more people will focus their minds on the reality.
It's often the case that when you experience loss, you go through the stages of grief. And I'm not sure we've gotten out of denial here. I mean, I think we're largely still in denial. And to get to the right side of that evolutionary change, we need to come to grips with a lot that, sure, the scientists and the forward thinking people and those who accept what's right in front of their face and don't argue with the reality get it. They understand. But there's such a small portion of the population that needs to move. And yet there's such a large portion of the population that are sheep-like, that follow leaders. And so if we could get the leaders to mobilize the followers, we'd have a chance. I'm just waiting for that to happen. I shouldn't say waiting. I'm doing my part as best I can. And this conversation is just one day in that effort, but I'm not a leader in the sense of the world leaders who people look to and listen to. And I wish more people were listening to you and reading your books, because they're very insightful and important education. I'm curious, if you were a leader of a world power, what would you be asking the people listening to you to do to start this process?
That's put in a very difficult way to answer with a simple question, simple answer.
Didn't have to be simple.
Well, there are so many things we need to do, and I think we are beginning to become aware of it. I mean, let's just take energy at the moment. This is a particular issue in Britain where we have an energy crisis coming up and are faced with a winter coming with massive rises in the cost of energy. People are having to choose between heating and eating.
Thank you, Russia.
It's a great cry. Yeah, it's Russia and it's the Ukrainian war was the breadbasket of Europe and so on. But it's more than that. It's the fact that we consume electricity gratuitously because it's been so cheap, and it is now going to be much more expensive. There are solutions to that, and one of the solutions that I have in my book is that, and in fact, it's how I think we will avoid wars in the future, is to use the great technology that is now available for producing renewable energy in a massive way, so that everybody in the world has free electricity.
Doesn't that seem obvious? Doesn't it just seem obvious? I mean,
it's available. I mean, the sun produces 1,000 times more energy than we could ever consume,
right,
or whatever we do.
Right.
And it should be, the internal combustion engine should be confined to history. And so I would say to everybody that the first thing you've got to do is move to driving an electric car. It's still a little more expensive and a little tricky and a little inconvenient. We've had electric cars for 10 years, and my son and I both drive electric cars. And very soon, we'll be able to generate all the electricity, store all the electricity we need in those cars, buying it either by buying it at the cheap rate during the middle of the night and storing it, or, as we're lucky enough to do because I put a wind turbine up and some photovoltaic array 12 years ago, store our own electricity, so we never need to buy anything from the grid. Now, if I was telling the story that a couple of years ago, just before COVID and all this happened, I was in Burma, up a little river, in quite a remote area.
Of course you were.
Came on this, of course I was. And I came on this little thatched hut, and there was a little solar panel on the top of it. And a nice man outside. And I asked him, I said, what's the solar panel for? And he said, to charge my mobile phone, of course. And I thought, hang on, here's somebody who's completely outside the mainstream, mains electricity, mains water, and everything, but he's in touch with the whole internet through that one little solar panel. Now, if everybody, you can leapfrog the whole industrial revolution that way. You don't need an awful lot of the things that we have infrastructure that we've become dependent on, mains water, mains sewage, mains electricity. You can have it yourself. If you have a few solar panels and you're in the middle of the African bush, you can save yourself that laborious job, which is usually down to the women, of walking for 5 hours to the nearest remaining bit of forest and cutting it down, turning it to charcoal, and coming back and cooking food for your family. You can remove yourself, and again, it's always women, from the burden of having to walk miles to the nearest polluted river and bring water back on your head for your family to drink, because you can have a solar-powered water pump and a solar-powered cooker. Now, this is not rocket science. It's already happening. These things are available, and some of the international aid that we're doing is going in that direction. But it should be universal. That would completely revolutionize everything, and it would be incredibly liberating, particularly for women in places like Africa, but also for everybody. And people could devote their efforts to conserving the environment and using the extraordinary legacy that the human species has created on Earth of poetry, music, art, and intellectual study, instead of desperately striving to survive by fighting the environment, which is what all too many people do today.
So true. And, the renewables are increasing. Solar was early on the landscape. I mean, it's evolving and it's better, but I mean, battery backup is, one of the newest really important things, because you can collect a lot of solar power that you don't use. And if you can't back it up, it's sort of lost. So there are lots of things happening. I think cold fusion is going to make a massive difference in the world when we get that up and running, but it's still probably decades away. And I don't understand, honestly, how everybody doesn't see what's happening. I'm still shocked when I see first world countries still taking wastewater and dumping it into the ocean straight away. It's
a big problem in Britain.
It's a big problem everywhere. How could it not be? I mean, what are they thinking? I mean, it's like the world's oceans are our toilets. And I can't understand that, especially since there's plenty of technology to deal with it. I don't think they need to do that. I just don't get it. So,
well, it just requires research and investment. And if we were preoccupied with research into how to deal with polluting the oceans, for instance, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and clearing up that enormous area of plastic waste that's floating around. And we now have research, which is exciting, showing that you can have microbes. There are microbes which will eat plastic and devour it and turn it back into organic matter. And that is where we should be devoting our research, to find those sort of solutions to the problem, because it's all doable. And it's only that we get carried away with this insane obsession with outer space, and the insane obsession with killing each other, which was happening with in Ukraine at the moment.
yeah, well, killing each other seems to be a historical imperative. And in fact, can you imagine where our population would be if we weren't such a rapacious, repugnant killing machine? I mean, we've killed so many people. The world would be even more overpopulated. It's a sad way to look at it, but you look at tiger, for example, and lions, they have their balance, they have their ecosystem. There's a certain number, and if you cross into their territory, boy, there's a fight and the leader takes over. It's just doesn't seem to be that way with people. We all go to our corners and we overpopulate, and then we try and kill more people and overpopulate in a different place. It's just hard to understand, really, if anybody's even thought about this. And now is the time, because there's not going to be much longer we can think about it. I mean, China years ago went to zero population growth, and then they backed off of that. They had one child policy that failed, and I don't know. I don't have solutions necessarily. That's why I was asking you if you were a world power. where would you start the process? I realize there's a million things to do, but you got to start the ball tumbling. How would you initiate that if you were going to ask people, do this one thing to help us start in the right direction?
But it's all very easy to say ban things, of course, and we know that doesn't always work. But what I would ban is the internal combustion engine very quickly, because the internal combustion engine using fossil fuels to generate power simply isn't acceptable anymore nowadays. And so I would, and there would be serious consequences of doing this. But if we actually moved away from coal and oil and gas and made those much tighter timetable than already, we have a quite encouraging timetable over here where there'll be no more internal combustion engine cars made after 2030, which is only 7 or 8 years away. And but it needs to go much further than that. At the moment, the oil industry and the coal and gas industries are heavily subsidized by governments, and this is all kept fairly well hidden. People are not aware of it.
Amazing.
And we are actually subsidizing them to a greater degree than the subsidization of the new green energy production, which everybody is enthusiastic about and complains that they're getting too much money. But actually, if I was in that happy position of ruling the world, that's the first thing I would do. And there would be terrible consequences. There always are from radical change. But we would have to find to use all that investment into renewable energy, which actually is doable. And it's now manifestly doable. Everybody now can see that wind and solar and nuclear, indeed, we have to go back to nuclear. I come from the generation of CND and opposing nuclear as the very bad thing when it was a threat militarily. But most scientists, or a lot of scientists, have now, who were against nuclear, have now come around to the idea that small nuclear power stations are in fact a very efficient and effective way of providing electricity during the transitional period until we get it all free from nature.
You know, it's interesting because in the United States, we have intransigence at the national level involving lobbyists and pouring money into political campaigns that's, as they call it, dark money. No one knows where it's coming from. I think that's how things like coal and gas and all these fossil fuel interests are keeping this thing going. And
Clearly.
if we could strip that away, it would be a positive step toward letting the market balance itself. Everyone could see, not only have we pretty much sucked out the middle of the earth, how many more dinosaurs do we need to pull out? It's time. We've evolved. Why not move on, make money? That seems to be the great thing for everybody. Figure out a way to make money out of it. And in the electric car world, you know, Elon Musk has done that. He's proven electricity and in cars is a moneymaker. But you know, the car industry, the gas car industry, bought out electric cars 100 years ago. There were electric car designs early on, and they were all killed one after the other until Musk said, "I'm not selling. You can't kill me. I'm going to do it." And, you know, I give him great credit for that because unlike everyone who came before, he's created a pathway for making money using electric power. And he's now followed up with solar power and Tesla batteries, all of which I have at my house. And I think are brilliant. And they're going to get so much better. I mean, right now, they're nowhere near. I think in 10 years, 5 years even, they'll probably be generations better. So.
Well, you know, Queen Victoria drove an electric car back in the 19th century. One of the very first cars that were designed in Britain were electric buggies she drove in. And I quite agree. I think what Elon Musk has done is quite extraordinary. And I would love to have a Tesla. I can't afford them yet over here, but they are very impressive vehicles. And what he's done with battery technology and the whole way he's transformed it is very visionary and exciting. On the other hand, like so many billionaires, he has this strange obsession with outer space.
He's got a side to him, that is for sure.
I've got a little piece coming out. I've been allowed to explode about this subject in nice magazine we have here called Country Life, and I've got a piece coming out next week entitled "The Emperor's New Spacesuit," and I describe the story, the children's story of everybody knows that the Emperor's new clothes, when two crooks persuaded the Emperor to have a new suit made, which would only be visible to people of virtue. So everybody around him all said, "Oh, you look wonderful, and it's a lovely suit, and gosh, that's pretty," and so on. And he did parades through the street, and one little child in the front row said, "But he's stark naked." And suddenly everybody realized that that was true. And I believe that the scales are going to fall from our eyes, and we're going to realize that this enormous effort, an obsession with going to outer space. Inner space is a different story, but outer space, where we might possibly find 1 or 2 microbes on Mars, which in a billion, or was it a million years, a billion more likely, will turn into something approximating life on Earth and therefore of interest. I couldn't care less what's out in space, and I'm not really interested in the origins of the universe. It's an interesting intellectual exercise, but it's not relevant to my own cosmos. I think even the fantastic Elon Musk, I believe, is profoundly flawed in that ideology and worrying about space.
It's interesting. I'm going to take a slightly different view of this because while I agree with you, we don't have a plan B when it comes to living on another planet. I don't see that as viable in any foreseeable lifetime. I give you that. But I think there's much to be learned and much to be gained from the exploration. And remember, it's private industry that's spending the money. If Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos want to spend billions of their privately well-deserved, hard-earned money on chasing into space and helping us learn from what might be out there, I have no problem with that. I agree with you, though. We shouldn't be deluding ourselves into thinking that it's an alternative to restoring the Earth. It's just never going to be doable.
Why not spend that money on understanding this planet, which
because it's not our money. I agree with you 1,000%.
But I just wish I wish they would do that. I wish they would realize just how fascinating and how much more interesting this planet is than the sterility of outer space. It just amazes me.
Okay, now you're making a different argument. I agree with that argument that if they wanted to spend their money, it would be way more productive in that way. But guess what? Both of them have enough money to do both. If they spent a good portion of their money on space and a good portion on Earth restoration, it would make a much bigger difference for the Earth than it will be for us in space. But again, it's not our money. If it was government spending this kind of money, I'd be right there with you, throwing up my.
Quite a lot of it is government money. NASA is not privately funded.
Well, but Musk and the work he's doing is mostly funded by him.
But most of the research into space is funded by the government. And one of the clever things that they're obsessional about it. And one of the things that I discovered was why does everybody go along with this? And partly it is this insane Emperor's New Clothes mania of not understanding that we don't want to go and live in space and that the whole thing's a chimera anyway. But it is also the fact I understand that every state in the United States has industries which benefit through NASA's activities. Therefore, it's a good move on politicians all around to be in favor of it. I think that's a sad nonsense. And it's the basis of, it's the unacceptable face of capitalism, as somebody once said over here.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. But I wasn't aware how much money you're saying the public is putting into that. I know they get paid
$850 billion a year. $850 billion a year, NASA's current budget.
Well, yes, but there's a lot more going on with NASA than just exploring outer space. NASA is involved with a lot of the inner space satellites and wars and tracking and a lot of things that are necessities of human repugnance to living in harmony with others. But I think that's a different argument. It's not the outer space explorations that I think are so exciting to Bezos and to Musk, really. But I agree with you. It would be nice if they would spend their money on the planet because it would go a long way. There's so many things. I mean, I guess that we could start almost anywhere. The bottom line is we should start already. We really need to start really making an effort to restore
You
that.
asked me what I would do if I ruled the world, and that's the first. Now that I think about it, that's the first thing I'd do would be cancel the whole space research,
That's
and only
interesting.
anything beyond the moon. I'm not interested in. I
Ahead
agree
of
that,
cars, ahead of fossil fuels.
well, both could go together.
Okay. Okay. Good
Use
for
that
you.
money. Use the 850 billion to replace the internal combustion engine with renewable energy for everybody. Free electricity for all would be my cry.
I like that. So let me shift direction for a little bit. Aging is something that is, been looked at from many perspectives. The youth is wasted on the young, for example. That's one perspective. But most people lose a lot of ground as they age. You seem to have more of your faculties than any young people I know, and of course, the accumulated wisdom and insight. So, what's the secret if you could share something? Is it chocolate milkshakes, I hope?
I wish it was as easy as that. It's just luck. I mean, I having been extremely ill and looked into the pit and seen the white light and been very near death um, recently, it does give you a different perspective. And my wife was told 3 times that it was less than 5% chance of my surviving, and if I did, I'd be severely brain damaged. And the miracle of the fact that I appear not to be, you may, after today's discussion, you may well
No, you're
agree with the
you're
doctors, but
totally in command of your faculties.
but I'm just so lucky that every day I just wake up and say, at my age, nothing hurts, and my brain is still working for a bit longer, and I got to make the most of it. And so I'm hard at work on my sequel to the Taming the Four Horsemen, which I would love to call "I Told You So," but I'm not allowed to do that because that might be a
Well,
mite arrogant. But I'm working on a good title for it.
I think gratefulness is a pretty important thing, and I try to wake up every morning with that in mind. And obviously, it's something that you recognize, and you've been through so many things. And looking, as you say, death in the face is it's a nice thing to be able to reflect on and kind of hold in its place for the time. So
But one
that's
does become increasingly aware that the time is running out, and that no, it won't be long before I'm pushing up the daisies. And knowing that I'm just a bunch of microbes anyway, pushing up the daisies is actually quite a comforting idea.
Yeah, and you know what? None of us is guaranteed any time. I mean, some people die the first day they're born, other people live for a long, long time and they do nothing. You've
Mm.
made a tremendous use of your time already, and I'm sure there's much more to come. So, and speaking of which, you're also a proud papa. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with your amazing son, Merlin?
Well, we've just had a new grandchild, which is wonderful, and got a 2-year-old who is, they're extraordinary children, how rapidly they learn. And his parents are great at her parents, she's called Loveday, are wonderful at teaching her about nature, and we go for walks every day. And I am constantly astonished. At 2, she tells me the name of plants. I thought I knew quite a bit about nature and all that. But the other day we were looking, and she was going through them and saying, that's a daffodil, and that's a camellia, and that's a rhododendron, and what's that one? Uh, and she said, periwinkle. I didn't know we had periwinkles here. And somebody said, she remembered that. And I just find that so wonderful when children are obsessed. And she will spend a lot of time looking at things and gathering insects together and plants, and really interested in nature. And I have hope, as I said earlier, for the future, that the young people are much more aware of the dangers that we face, but also much more interested in what goes on and how nature works. And there have been some fantastic films. I mean, we've had our great David Attenborough over here, who's really opened the eyes of the world to what's going on. And it's so exciting what you're doing with Ecoflix, because that's the same thing. And that, I believe, is terribly important, that we educate people and inform people about how wonderful and varied and diverse and interesting this planet is, far more interesting than computer games.
Yes, that's for sure. So if you're talking now to all the parents and guardians out there with small children, what would be the top 2 or 3 things that you would do to instill that love of nature and all living things in your children and grandchildren?
Go for a walk. Just go for a walk. Go for a walk. And hopefully live in a country where you have a government and people who are interested in creating an interesting environment and who will help forests to grow, nature to thrive, so that children, when you go for a walk with them in that environment, will have lots to see and lots to be interested in. And at the same time, educate them and only let them watch Ecoflix when they want to know how the world works. Don't bother to watch anything else.
Well, that's a good thought. I guess we can't do much better than that than bring this to a close. I wouldn't want to spoil that wonderful advice. Robin, it's such a pleasure always to talk to you. I hope to speak again soon, and I really appreciate you taking the time for this podcast. I hope everybody got a lot out of it. I know I did.
Thanks, David. That was really interesting. I don't know where you drew some of that stuff out from, but you scraped the barrel with my thoughts.
It's from you, and that's why it was such an inspiring conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.